So we saw useEffect in action here in the scenario with no dependencies. Now, often you need dependencies because you don't just want to run this effect function once when the app starts up, but indeed after every component re-evaluation if a certain dependency changed. And an example can be found in the login component. That's the component where I actually render this form here. That's being rendered here. And as you see, there is actually some validation built in. If I click in here and I click out, you, for example, see this is marked as red. And also the button is only enabled if I have entered something valid in both inputs here, right? So otherwise, the button is disabled. So we got some validation, and currently, the validation works such that for every keystroke on the email field, this email change handler runs, and it sets the form as valid if the email contains an @ symbol and the entered password was correct. And we get the same for the password change handler. And I also got the validate email handlers where I set email and password as valid whenever the inputs blur, so whenever they lose focus, so that they also are marked as invalid if I just click in there, enter nothing, and click somewhere else. Now, where could we use useEffect here? Well, for example, to restructure our validation logic here. Instead of having essentially the same logic, just, well, swapped basically, in the email and the password change handler, we could use useEffect to have one place where we mark the form as valid or invalid with one logic, which should trigger whenever either the email or the password changed. And that's where we will need an extra dependency. So therefore here, we can again import useEffect. And then here, after our state definitions, we can call useEffect and pass this first function to it. And have our array of dependencies. Now in this first function, I will call setFormIsValid. But of course, I will not use the event target value, but I will check if the entered email includes the @ symbol and the entered password is longer than 6 characters. Now, like this would only run once, and that's when this component first is rendered. So therefore, if I remove that logic from the password and the email change handler, you will see that I can reload this and I can type in there. And my form, well, this button never gets enabled. And the reason for that is simply that this effect only ran once, as I said, when the component rendered for the first time. Now, that was the right behavior in the app component with our login state. It's definitely the wrong behavior here, though. We want to re-evaluate this and rerun this form validation state setting function for every keystroke in email and password change handler. Now, we could remove the dependencies array. Now, don't save this because this would crash your page. This would make sure that this runs whenever this component was re-evaluated. Therefore, effectively, in this case, it's the same as if we would have moved this code directly here into the component function itself. Because now, without any dependencies, this code reruns whenever the component was re-rendered, and since we set state in here, this would trigger a re-render cycle itself, hence we would have an infinite loop. So saying nothing about the dependencies is not what we want, but no dependencies is also not what we want. Then it would only run once. Well, indeed, there is a simple rule. You add as dependencies what you're using in your side effect function. So in this case, we are using the setFormIsValid function, we are using entered email, and we are using entered password. Includes and trim are only called on those entered email and entered password fields then. So we have setFormIsValid, entered email, and entered password. These are our 3 things we're using here. So therefore, here, between these brackets, you would add setFormIsValid, entered email, and entered password, just like this. Important, for setForm is valid, you of course don't execute it. That would add the result of this function execution as a dependency. But instead you add it like this to add a pointer at this function, so that you essentially add the function itself as a dependency. And this tells React that after every login component function execution, it will rerun this effect function, but only if either setForm is valid or entered email or entered password changed in the last component re-render cycle. If neither of the three changed, this effect function will not rerun. Now actually, you can also omit setForm is valid because those state updating functions by default are ensured by React to never change. So these functions will always be the same across re-render cycles, so you can omit them. Entered email and entered password could have changed, of course. To be precise, with every keystroke, one of them will change. So if we now save this, and we try this again, you see the login button still enables and disables. And the reason for that is that now this effect function reruns whenever entered email or entered password changed. So that's another scenario where useEffect shines. It helps us make sure that we have one code in one place, instead of, as before, in multiple places, which reruns whenever one of the dependencies changed. And that's also something where you use useEffect. So it's not just for when a component was created for the first time, but it's equally common to use it to rerun logic when certain data, typically some state or some props, changed. Now, one aspect that could be confusing here is that, of course, now inside of this useEffect example, we're not working with local storage, we're not sending a HTTP request, we're not setting a timer or anything like that. Instead, we are updating the React state. And that could be confusing if you recall that slide from earlier, where I had a slightly different separation. So to clear that confusion, you must not forget that it's called useEffect, and it has one main job. It's there to handle side effects. And often, side effects are HTTP requests and so on. But it's also a side effect if we listen to every keystroke and save that entered data, as we're doing it in the email change handler, for example, and we then want to trigger another action in response to that. So checking and updating that form validity in response to a keystroke in the email or password field, that is also something you could call a side effect. It's a side effect of the user entering data. So that's why this should not confuse you. useEffect in general is a super important hook that helps you deal with code that should be executed in response to something. And something could be the component being loaded, it could be the email address being updated, it could be anything. Whenever you have an action that should be executed in response to some other action, that is a side effect. And that is where useEffect is able to help you. That's just a little addition I want to make here.